Is creation an arrogant act, traveler? If not, why do we call the ones that created us and control us gods? If it is, then what qualifies us to call ourselves creators? How far must we take our reverence and respect, and what purpose does it serve?
Is creation an act of arrogance? That is the conundrum which Albedo postulates to the Traveler, a sentiment that is later shared and echoed by a former member of the Narcissus Cruz Ordo, Caterpillar, when talking about his former master, the Mage Narcissus Cruz, also known as the evil dragon Narcissus. The Narcissus Cruz Ordo, founded by René de Petrichor and Jacob Ingold after their fallout with the siblings of the Narcissus Cruz Institute, Marianne and Hélène Guillotine, had the objective of transforming all of humanity into new humans that would survive the end of the world, which René saw in his dreams after finding the Conrian world formula during his expedition into the realm of Parakhkert and Sumeru. Caterpillar recalls that he came to exist as we know him after his consciousness was placed in the body of a Hilichurl rogue by René, who by then had merged with the Oceanid Laris and became the Mage Narcissus Cruz, who wielded the Holy Blade of Narcissus Cruz. Very likely an artifact of ancient Remuria, which could separate the soul from the body, just like how the god Remus could split the souls and refine the primordial waters into golden ichor. But with all that talk about Narcissus Cruz this, Narcissus Cruz that, just what the heck is Narcissus Cruz? Well, the word itself is German and translates to daffodil cross, which is a symbol that you can see all over Fontaine and likely originates from the ancient scattered tribes of the High Waters, which were later conquered and assimilated by Remus into his empire. However, I am particularly interested in the name daffodil, as it refers to Narcissus, a genus of plants that flower during spring. And the Narcissus flowers attribute their name to the Greek myth of the hunter Narcissus and the nymph Echo. And here, I need you all to pay attention because this story does not only inspire the entirety of the Narcissus Cruz saga, but it will also set the tone for the rest of this video and is absolutely critical for understanding the story of Fontaine. In ancient Greece, legends say that when the nymph Liriope gave birth, the son she had was a male of unrivaled beauty, whom she named Narcissus. Fun fact, the word narcissism is derived from his name, and you are about to know why that is the case. Soon after his birth, fearing prying eyes on her boy, Liriope sought the advice of the seer Terseus on how to best raise him, to which the latter informed her that her son would live a long life so long as he never discovers himself. As a young lad, all who saw Narcissus would comment on his beauty and grace, which gave the young boy an extremely inflated ego. Soon enough, Narcissus grew into a very handsome youth, so handsome in fact that many women from all walks of life made an attempt on him. But Narcissus would spurn them all, and male suitors would also fall in love with him, but just like their female counterparts, Narcissus would reject them all as well, and sometimes go as far as to publicly humiliate them, causing them to take their own lives. Preferring to walk alone in life, Narcissus left a long trail of broken hearts along his path. On the other side of our story, Hera, the goddess of marriage, was enraptured by a fantastic tale being told to her by her mountain nymph Echo, who was known for being a very elegant speaker with a silver tongue and told the greatest of stories. However, Hera soon realized that Echo's stories were but a distraction at the behest of Hera's husband Zeus, as he cheated with the other mountain nymphs. So, enraged at her husband's actions, yet powerless to stop him, Hera took her wrath on Echo instead, cursing her to never talk again and only repeat the last words a person says. And so, with no one willing to talk to her, Echo would walk the earth sad and alone. One day, while walking in the forest, Echo stumbled upon the young Narcissus hunting there, and she instantly fell for him, but could not approach him for she lacked the ability to start a conversation, and thus she followed him in silence. Narcissus felt that he was being trailed and asked his stalker to reveal themselves. Echo could not explain, but only repeated what Narcissus said while trying her best to sound as enduring as possible. When she went to embrace him, Narcissus snapped and rejected her, telling her that he would rather die than love her, which left her demoralized. Echo walked away heavy of heart until nothing remained of her but her sound, reverberating in lonely glens. Seeing what had happened, Nemesis, the goddess of revenge, decided to punish Narcissus by luring him into a clear pool. Kneeling down to drink, the hunter saw himself and was so captivated that he did not realize it was merely his own reflection. Days and nights passed, and Narcissus remained in that position. Eventually, the youth realized that his love could never be reciprocated, and his soul melted from the fire of passion, leaving nothing behind but a white golden flower bending into its own reflection in the water. Many years later, around a field of Narcissus, the young goddess Persephone would be strolling with her Oceanids picking flowers before she was snatched away by Hades, the god of the dead, to become his wife in the underworld. The goddess Hecate then assisted Persephone's mother Demeter in searching for her daughter in the underworld, lighting up the way with her torches, only for the mother to be denied her daughter by Hades. Demeter would then ask Persephone's father and Hades' brother Zeus to bring her daughter back, but the latter was reluctant as he did not want to upset his brother. In her grief, Demeter covered the world in ice, and all life began to die. Thus, the king of the gods Zeus was first to take action and mediated a compromise between the mother and the husband, then sent Hermes to retrieve Persephone. And ironically, it would be in a field of Narcissus that Persephone would later be reunited with her mother. Demeter rejoiced, for her daughter was again by her side, and spring covered the earth once more. Okay, this was the myth of Narcissus and Echo. Keep it in mind because it will be extremely relevant. But for now, let's get back to Albedo's penultimate question. And to answer it, we are going to have to start it in the least expected of all places. In the Knights of Favonius library, we stumble upon Ella Musk, a scholar of Helicrolian linguistics. Her primary goal is fostering communication between humans and Helicrols. You probably came across her several times while doing commissions in Mondstadt by now. Despite her flaws, Ella successfully conducts several simple conversations with Helicrols, proving that peaceful interactions are possible. And you know who else can speak Helicrolian? Kaya, who happens to not only be from Conria, but is also a distant relative of Clothar Albrecht, the founder of the Abyss Order. Speaking of Conrians, during the Requiem of the Echoing Depths Archon quest, we learned from Dainsleif that pure-blooded Conrians were considered great sinners by Celestia and blighted with the curse of immortality, while others like Caribert, the son of Clothar, who was not a pure-blooded Conrian since his mother was from Mondstadt, were given the curse of the wilderness and transformed into Helicrols. Now, at first glance, one can easily be confused considering that the so-called great sinners were granted the curse of immortality when other humans were turned into Helicrols. However, when you put it into perspective, the curse of immortality is a significantly harsher punishment than its alternative, because while the body is immortal, the human mind is not suitable to process life for such a prolonged period of time, and as we witness with Clothar, they eventually break and go insane. Given enough time, mortal minds will deteriorate to such a degree that they become husks of themselves, losing all semblance of their consciousness, memory, and self-awareness. Or do they? You see, when we encounter Halfdan in the chasm with Dainsleif, the former chooses not to attack us as the other Black Serpent Knight husks did. Instead, he simply wanders around in search of his purpose. And not to cut the flow of the conversation, but I want you to remember the word purpose because it's going to be an extremely crucial theme. Dainsleif is then surprised that Halfdan was able to recognize him despite lacking it. Now, knowing what I told you, it should then be some kind of condition or blessing that the Conrians cursed with immortality like Piero and Dainsleif have that allows them to maintain their sanity. And the members of the Abyss Order, who also belong to Conria, reinforce this sentiment since the Hydro Abyss Herald we encounter during the We Will Be Reunited Archon quest tells Dainsleif that he reeks of the same corruption as him. But what is it? Well, it is certainly a similar it to the one that Jacob Ingold has, which makes the composition of his body similar to that of the Gaukrena in the Vorokasha Oasis and allows René to transform him into an abyssling. And it is almost definitely the it that Skirk saw in Ajax when she first stumbled upon him in the abyss and sensed his connection to the All-Devouring Narwal. Thus, I have a very good proposition for as to what this it is. And the answer to our question comes straight from the chrysalis of the phantasmic moth, Caterpillar, and the Knave of Hearts, Arlecchino. And now, it's time to talk about psychology. A lot of psychology. And to do that, let me introduce Carl Jung. Well, let's backtrack a little bit and first talk about Jung's mentor, Sigmund Freud, because it is really difficult to fully understand Jung without first knowing who Freud was. You see, despite starting from the same point and working very closely for years, Jung and Freud could not have ended up further away from one another in the end. Freud proposed the idea of the psyche being divided into three parts: the id, ego, and superego, where the id is the primitive instinctual part of the mind that operates on the pleasure principle, seeking immediate gratification of basic needs and desires. The ego develops from the id and operates on the reality principle. It seeks to satisfy the id's desires in a realistic and socially acceptable way. The ego helps mediate between the id and the external world, and finally, the superego represents the moral and ethical aspects of the psyche. It is formed through the influence of social norms, parental guidance, and cultural factors as it aims for perfection and judges the actions of the ego. Enter Carl Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who founded the analytical psychology and developed the Myers-Briggs type indicator. Jung is arguably one of the most, if not the most influential figure in the history of psychology and neuroscience. Unlike Sigmund Freud, who suggested the primal sexual and aggressive drives are the primary motivators of humans, Jung introduced the concept of archetypes and the collective unconscious, stating that the pursuit of harmony and balance through self-discovery, personal growth, and the realization of one's potential, dreams, and goals. Okay, I know what some of you might be wondering. Why am I saying any of this? What does any of it have to do with Genshin Impact? Alright, listen. I'm going to go ahead and explain Jung's model for the psyche, and as I do so, you are going to realize just how insanely similar it is to everything that happened in Genshin Impact. The entire world of Genshin Impact is literally built on the work of Carl Jung. Like, holy shit, the lead writers of the story at Hoyoverse are such fans of this guy, it is actually disgusting. You know what, let's just get into it. Jung separates the psyche into three primary aspects: the conscious, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. The conscious mind is the everyday awareness of thoughts, feelings, and experiences, representing the ego, the center of conscious awareness. While the personal unconscious contains an individual's unique experiences, memories, and emotions that are not currently conscious awareness. This includes the repressed or forgotten aspects of the individual's personal history. And finally, the collective unconscious refers to the deeper layer of unconscious mind that is shared by all humans, containing universal experiences, memories, and symbols. Unlike the personal unconscious, which is unique to the individual, the collective unconscious holds archetypes, innate universal symbols, and themes. Jung proposed that the collective unconscious is inherited and contains a reservoir of images, memories, and dreams that shape human experiences, behaviors, and cultural expressions, and acts as a source of creativity and a framework for understanding and interpreting the common aspects of the human experience across different cultural times. Now, Jung mentions a variety of different archetypes, such as the mother, the persona, and the list goes on and on, but for this video, I want to focus on three in particular. Starting with the self. This represents the center of the total personality, the goal of the individuation and the integration of the conscious and the unconscious aspects. It stands for unity, wholeness, and the realization of one's true potential. Jung uses the mandala, a geometric figure prominent in Christian and Buddhist theologies representing unity and completeness, to represent the self. Next, the anima and the animus. These represent the feminine and masculine aspects of the mind, which should be integrated together for one to achieve balance and become complete. Interestingly enough, this concept is also fundamental in alchemy, with the idea of the primordial human, the perfect unity of male and female, and the primordial human project is the name of the project which Rheindotter undertook in Conria, going back to Albedo's question regarding whether creation is an arrogant act. Remember that Rheindotter utilized the art of chemia to create imitations of life. But as Caterpillar said, creation is a feat reserved for a god, and the god of humanity, the primordial one, was androgynous in nature. And finally, moving on to Jung's ultimate archetype. You know what? Never mind. I'm going to stop here and get back to the third archetype later in this video because it will be extremely relevant later on. For now, we reached a perfect segue for the next few topics which I will discuss. During the world quest upon a flowery field of grass, the traveler stumbles upon a garden of purple flowers, after which a tall old man named Earnshaw tells the traveler to leave his flowers alone lest he tramples them. Later on, the traveler and Paimon help Earnshaw retrieve his three dogs, Prince, Princess, and Hero. Following a few conversations and a very tasty bowl of ragout, Earnshaw tells the traveler that those three dogs were the pets of his daughter, Agnes, who left home a long time ago following a quarrel that they had. And despite Agnes sending Earnshaw 3 letters a few years later, the latter chose not to read them out of pride and anger. A short while later, in Riasse's fortress of Meripede, the traveler comes across a little girl named Lenore, who asks the traveler to go on with her in an adventure as she tells him about good sorcerers and evil sorcerers, then takes him to her friend Katar, who happens to be Caterpillar, And yes, this is the same caterpillar that the artist Julien tells us about in the Samudra coast, and as it turns out, Caterpillar was once acquainted with Lenore's mother, Agnes, the daughter of Earnshaw, who had died by the time the traveler got to Meropide. During the World Quest Game of the Rich, Caterpillar tells Lenore a story about a little girl who lived in a giant's garden surrounded by purple flowers and towering walls. One day, a witch sought the flowers to cure her friend, but the furious giant refused her request. Hearing the woman's plight, the little girl felt sorry for her and her friend and thus sought to help her. The witch used her magic to transport the girl outside, but when she tried to return, the garden, the giant, and the wall had all vanished. When the little girl asks the witch to return home, the tall witch laughs, asking her what would she get in return that time. Here, I want to quickly mention that Caterpillar's story is likely a reference to Earnshaw and his daughter Agnes when she was young. Lenore then proceeds to tell Caterpillar her own story. This time, the tale takes place in the garden of the giant, full of beautiful purple flowers where a princess, a prince, and a brave hero once lived. One day, a witch approaches the giant asking him for some of his flowers to cure her sick oceanic friend in a distant fountain. But the mean giant treasured them so much that he wouldn't let anyone pick even a single one. The witch then tells the giant that she knows many spells and could use one of them to help the giant with something in exchange for the flowers. Thinking it over, the giant told the witch that long ago he had lost something very important to him, and thus they made a deal. In the end, the witch's friend recovered and the giant found what he had lost. With all that being said, I want to make one thing very clear. Even though the story of the Giant's Garden is clearly a reference to Earnshaw, Agnes, and Lenore, it is extremely vital to recognize that this story could also very well be an allegory to a different tale from Tevat's distant past, but perhaps this time with a real giant, a Seelie princess, and a witch. And this takes us back to what I said a few minutes earlier when I asked you to pay attention, since one of my primary objectives in this video is to teach you to think outside of the box when it comes to what you see and hear in Genshin Impact, especially when it comes to stories that reference fairy tales and mythology, because what the developers at Hoyoverse put in this game is almost always extremely deliberate and meaningful. Speaking of myths and fairy tales, remember how Renee created Kater as an intelligent Hillicroll using the Holy Blade? Well, when questioned further by the Traveler on his creation, Caterpillar says that it is not correct to say that Narcissus created him, elaborating that creation is a feat reserved exclusively for a god, and it involves imagination, imagining the totality of every facet of someone's being, every inch of detail, every cell of their body down to their very core. Caterpillar says that what happened to him was not creation but rather rebirth, and if we consider his words, I think most of you who have been following the Narcissus saga have already deduced that Caterpillar is Carter Sherbius, Alain Guillotine's engineer assistant from the Institute of Natural Philosophy over 460 years ago. For those unfamiliar with Carter, here's the scoop. The man was extremely sick, likely infected with Elazar or something similar after exposure to contaminated water during the Cataclysm of Khaenri'ah 500 years ago. He met Renee and Jacob after their return from the Vurukasha Oasis and their joining of Elan in the Institute of Natural Philosophy. Thinking he could cure Carter, Renee performs the same operation he did on Jacob to transform him into an abyssling, but fails terribly. Carter turns into an unrecognizable sludge, screeching in continuous agony. Eventually, in regret, Renee kills Carter and absorbs him into Narcissus, then remakes him in the shape of a Hillicroll using the Holy Blade. Here, there are several important details that I must point out. First, notice how the manner in which Renee plucks out Carter's soul and places it into an imagined Hillicroll vessel is extremely reminiscent of how Elenus tells the Traveler that he used to be a formless floating will in the abyss that cried from the cold and loneliness before Rheindotter found him and gave him a name and a draconic body that eventually became the birthplace of the Melazines. And what Rheindotter did with Elenus is in turn extremely reminiscent of how Morax, the god of contract, heard Ajdaha's cries thousands of years ago, then lifted him from the bottom of the earth and gave him eyes to see the world. Keep this in mind, we will get back to it later. The second important detail has to do with the tenets of the Narcissus, who preach that creation is a feat for a god and requires the complete imagination of what is created. Now, I have proposed several times before, and in particular in this video right here, that Genshin Impact is still missing two quote-unquote elements, because Dainsleif and the Traveler siblings in the original form and Paimon are all likely to become playable characters. But here's the thing, they do not belong to any of the 7 elements, and neither does Skirk as far as I can tell. Now, I have previously called these forces the powers of chaos and order, or to put it in Honkai terms, the forces of quantum and imaginary. But it doesn't actually matter what they are called. The Void and the Gvarena, the Abyss and Celestia, call them whatever you want. What matters is the undeniable fact that they exist. Now, to simplify how I conceptualize these two forces, here's how you can look at them. Think of the 7 colors of the rainbow. These colors constitute different wavelengths of light that humans can see, and beyond them lies the infrared and the ultraviolet that human eyes cannot detect. Similarly, the 7 elements of the god make up the composition of the human or physical realm, which is logical and comprehensible to human minds. But beyond them, on either ends, lies the forces of quantum and imaginary, which do not belong to the physical realm and are thus incomprehensible to human minds. During his expedition in the desert, René remarks that elemental energy lacks a will of its own. However, he also notes that the power of the Abyss and the Gvarena are surprisingly similar to one another, taking interest in the fact that both possess a true will. And if we go back to Rheingotter, remember that she created Elenus by extracting his will from the Abyss and giving him a body presumably created through the art of Chemia. Now, the archi-forces of Numa and Usia and Fontaine are likely directly connected to the powers of Celestia and the Abyss. Furthermore, Numa energy, which by this logic should represent a simplified version of the imaginary force, is a Greek word which means the soul or creative force of a person. Linking this back to the imaginary force of Hoyoverse, imagination is a fundamental requirement for creativity. And creativity is what supplements creation, and in Genshin Impact, creation involves imagination. Since Elenus and his siblings were created through Chemia, then perhaps the art of Chemia directly relies on comprehensive and detailed imagination. Remember that Khaenri'ah was a kingdom that existed in close proximity to the roots of Irminsul, the tree of memories and dreams. Dainsleif, after all, is known as the Bowkeeper, while the Abyss Mages and Lectors drop leyline sprouts as loot when they are defeated. Considering that the imaginary force is like the power of the Primordial One and Celestia, if Chemia allows humans to tap into Irminsul and create life through the power of the Primordial One, then Celestia would not be very happy with such an overstepping of boundaries, methinks. Speaking of creativity and Chemia, Rheindotter's own son, Albedo, happens to be both a practitioner of Chemia and an artist. A painter, to be precise, with a vivid imagination. Moreover, as you know, art at its most basic definition is an expression of one's creativity, and in Fontaine, art is a major theme across the entire nation. First and foremost, the developers themselves mentioned during the 4.0 livestream that they took major inspirations from classical European paintings during the process of figuring out the art direction of the nation of Fontaine. Additionally, we meet several artists from Fontaine, one of whom is Julien, who we come across at Samudra Coast in Sumeru. Julien says that he fails to create real art because he lacks proper imagination, but Caterpillar tells the traveler that Julien's art was always good, he just needed to learn how to think outside of the box. Another artist you can meet in Fontaine is De Pieris, who has a very interesting line where he states that people's imaginations and the beauty and spirit in their hearts cannot be directly seized from the natural world. This is very interesting because another major theme in both Fontaine and Genshin Impact is fairy tales. After all, we go on a long fairy tale adventure with a little Oceanid named Anne to save Princess Laris from the evil dragon Narcissus, only to find ourselves face to face with an imaginary Marianne who lives in a fairy tale world that we enter through a painting in a book. Narratives and fairy tales tend to have an ambiguous cohesion which transcends our logical understanding of reality. Within the context of Genshin Impact, Teyvat's civilizations exist in a metaphysical story, which from the perspective of the Primordial One and Celestia would then be the divine story of humanity. And this divine story would have its reasons that transcend reason. Carl Jung's notion of how the world works, to simplify it for the theory, there are things that are absolutely beyond our comprehension, and there are things that we understand completely and in detail, and there is a border between the two. But make no mistake, this border is not a cutoff line where you transition from the physical world that you understand completely into a world full of things that your mind cannot possibly understand. As Jung describes it, the border is the land of the dreams, the land of the story, the land of the fantasy, the land of the myth. It is half unknown and mysterious and half explicit and fathomable. It is the space across which the unknown moves through before becoming explicit. What I am saying right now should sound familiar to you because it is almost exactly what I explained in my earlier analogy of the quantum imaginary and the 7 elements using the wavelengths of light. But more importantly, Jung's description of the 3 realms should immediately ring bells in your head, because that is almost identical to the 3 realms of Genshin Impact. the void or the abyssal realm, which is the realm of the indescribable and the unknown, where knowledge originates from, the human or the physical realm, which is the realm of the tangible and comprehensible, and finally the light or the elemental realm, which is what lies in between, the realm of dreams where dragons come from. Genshin Impact, with all of its overabundant reliance on real-life mythology and theology, along with its heavy references to fairy tales and its insistence on themes such as ambitions, obsessions, and memories that all connect to the ley lines of Irminsul, exists within a dreamlike metaphysics. And that is the Teyvat chapter of Genshin Impact, the Travail story, which within the human realm fills a gap. And if you tear out that gap and transform it into an ideology, then you end up with half-formed pathological fantasies taking its place. To elaborate on Carl Jung's theory, look no further than Friedrich Nietzsche, who was of profound importance to Jung. Nietzsche infamously proposed that God will die, and human ideologies will rise up to take his place, which is what we saw in Fontaine, as well as what took place with the Eclipse dynasty of Khaenri'ah, which was a godless nation that tore open the veil of sin and was thus cursed and destroyed by divinity. But wait a minute, there is still one more important Fontainean artist that I forgot to mention. Salsa! Now, I have already made a video discussing salsa, so I won't rehash all of that over again. But long story short, salsa is a direct reference to Pierro, and her quest chain is an analogy for as to how the jester founded the Fetui 500 years ago with the Tsaritsa, then went on to recruit Capitano and Dottore. And what a coincidence is it that we are on the topic of artists, because you know who else are considered artists? Theater actors! Actors of the Commedia dell'arte! What? You want me to spell it out for you? Arlecchino! And Arlecchino has this to say.
You think of yourselves as magicians, but when you're on the stage, you're first and foremost actors. Good actors hone their craft to mesmerize the whole crowd.
Mesmerize the audience, huh? Well, do you know who else can mesmerize people? Caterpillar, who is shown on multiple occasions across the story as being able to manipulate people with his words. But, before we continue, I have to address the elephant in the room. You see, a silver tongue is not the only feature that Arlecchino shares with Caterpillar, since both of them have extremely obvious and unnatural coal-black limbs. So, is the knave a helicrow? Will we see the first ever helicrow with boobs in Genshin Impact? Will Elon Musk manage to establish communication with Arlecchino? Tune in to know in the next time on Dragon Ball Z. Okay, well, maybe. But in reality, probably not. Here's the thing, let me explain. Arlecchino has a vision, and this alone poses a significant obstacle for any possibility of her being a helicrow, because helicrows do not need visions to manipulate the elements. Unlike humans, they can tap directly into the ley lines and utilize elemental energy. This is a fundamental fact that we learn early on in Genshin Impact during the Traveler's time in Mondstadt, and Caterpillar, who is a helicrow, further supports this as he is able to control the animal element without relying on a vision. Thus, Arlecchino being one would violate an essential component of our understanding of helicrows. However, this does not mean that the similarities between Arlecchino and Caterpillar are a coincidence. You see, in medieval Europe, coal-black hands were attributed to the practice of black magic and witchcraft. And here, I want to shift your attention all the way back to Lenore. Remember that in the Fortress of Meripede, the girl tells us that there are good and evil sorcerers, and Katar, in Lenore's eyes, is a good sorcerer who knows many spells. But he is not the only crafty magical boy in town, because Lini, Arlecchino's adopted son and successor, also happens to be a magician who knows many tricks. Therefore, if we extend this logic to Arlecchino, then she too must be a practitioner of magic. A witch. But it does not end here. Keep in mind that witches have been historically associated with devils, while the Commedia dell'arte's Arlecchino is also known as Harlequin. Starting off with Arlecchino, the name is derived from a devil that appears in Dante's Inferno named Arlecchino, who sits with the sinners in a lake. Yes, Lynette says that Fontaine is a giant inland lake and that the people in it bear the original sin. But I want you to ignore this for now because Arlecchino's other namesake is more interesting. Because Harlequin gets his namesake from the legendary Germanic king Herla of the Wild Hunt, who inspires a French devil known as Harlequin that appears in a theater play depicting the crucifixion of Jesus. Knowing that, it becomes obvious where the cross marks on Arlecchino's eyes come from. With that being said, the crucifixion of Christ is not just a story of death, but is also a story of resurrection. Carl Jung argues that the death and resurrection of Christ exemplifies the process of becoming one's true, unique self, represented by the hero's journey of facing darkness and subsequently conquering death and emerging victorious. And this perfectly brings us back to the third and final of the three archetypes of this video, Jung's ultimate archetype, the hero, which embodies the hero's journey of self-realization, facing challenges and rising from the ashes to achieve their ambition. Heroes often embark on quests, confront obstacles, and return with newfound wisdom or a boon for their people. Notice how every playable vision wielder in Genshin Impact has undergone their own version of the hero's journey, overcoming great adversity and obtaining their vision as a reward. Now, interestingly enough, during the Inazuma Arcane Quest, it is stated that a person's vision represents their ambition. Meanwhile, Caterpillar says that Narcissus Cruz believed that one's own will is an obstacle and that receiving a vision is a guaranteed path to destruction. But destruction through what? And why the hell would receiving a vision lead to destruction anyway? Unless, that's right, child's vision and the all-devouring narwhal in Fontaine. To fully understand what I'm going to explain, we need to first talk about this man, Confucius, a legendary Chinese philosopher and an extremely influential historical figure who founded Confucianism, a school of thought that heavily influences Genshin Impact. In Confucian thought, the sense of self is intricately connected to one's role in society. Rather than focusing on individualism, Confucianism places a strong emphasis on the familial and societal relationships. The self is seen as part of a larger fabric with duties and responsibilities to the family, community, and the broader society. Individuality in Confucianism is not dismissed, but it is understood in the context of fulfilling one's roles and obligations. The idea is to cultivate personal virtues such as benevolence, righteousness, propriety, wisdom, and trustworthiness to contribute positively to the collective, while morality is grounded in the concept of ren, often translated as benevolence or humanness. Confucius believed that individuals should strive to cultivate compassionate and virtuous characters, not just adhering to rules but embodying virtues in one's character and interactions. Finally, ambition in Confucianism is viewed in the context of moral development and service to society. While personal success and achievements are acknowledged, they are valued when aligned with ethical principles and contribute to the greater good. Ambition should be tempered by a sense of social responsibility and a commitment to virtuous conduct. We see visible examples of Confucianism taking place in Genshin Impact through the manner in which Zhongli governs the nation of Liyue, in addition to Rukkhadevata's emphasis on the dreams of the people of Sumeru, the growth of the collective, and the sustenance of harmony. And speaking of Rukkhadevata, when asked about visions, Nahida has the following to say.
The heavens grew eyes to behold the true beauty of the world below, but humans already have eyes to begin with. So, what is it they see when they look at the world not with their eyes, but their vision? You're very smart. Can you figure out what the answer is?
At first, most people, including myself, thought that Nahida is referring to Celestia. However, knowing what we now know, with Child's Narwhal being the literal embodiment of his constellation, we now have a completely different perspective for as to what this it that Skirk sensed in Tartaglia is. Alright, this part is going to be very important, so pay attention. Caterpillar tells us that Narcissus Cruz believed that a body with a self cannot truly comprehend reality as it fulfills the world through the five senses. Thus, the Order will often partake in a ritual known as the renunciation of the ego. Now, earlier in the video, I told you guys that the ego, according to Sigmund Freud, is the property that seeks to satisfy the primal human desires realistically. But according to the teachings of Hinduism, internal renunciation is the renunciation of the ego, whereas external renunciation is giving up possessions. Together, they are known as giving up the I and mine. And it is the former that results in enlightenment, the ability to transcend mortal constraints. But we are not done yet, we are going even further. According to Wings of Merciful Wrathful Waters, the god of life created the first Hydro Archon Igeria to replace the Dragon Sovereign of Water. The Wings then go to state that although Igeria was created by a ruler of humans, her substance and essence were all original matter from this world entirely without outside elements. And suddenly... Wait. Hold on a second. What did it just say again? Although Igeria was created by a ruler of humans, her substance and essence were all originally matter from this world entirely without outside elements. Do you guys realize what this sentence implies? The Primordial One created most humans from materials that do not belong to Tevat. And the reason I say most is because Rene and Jacob found out that the composition of their body is similar to the Gaukrena lotus that Rokadevata made to house the consciousness of Igeria, meaning that they are 100% native to Tevat. Listen, let me cook. In accordance with Buddhist teachings, achieving enlightenment coincides with the ability to observe the world for what it truly is. From the Buddhist scripture of Lotus Sutra, which is one of the most honored and venerated texts, when Buddha was born, he took 7 steps from his mother, upon which 7 lotuses bloomed, as he pointed his hands towards the sky and the earth, saying, "Throughout heaven and earth, I alone am the honored one." In the context of Genshin Impact, that would be the Primordial One, the honored one to whom the right of creation exclusively lies. As we established earlier, the Greek word pneuma means creative force, and creativity requires imagination, thus the power of the Primordial One would be the imaginary force. And in the Hoyoverse, the imaginary tree is an entity that sprung from and is locked in an eternal battle with the Sea of Quanta, where the tree is constantly seeking to absorb the sea, and the sea is seeking to flood the tree. This process is referenced in Genshin Impact's Court of Flowering Sands, which states that in antediluvian times, now lost to history, there was once a foolish ruler who dreamed of building a high garden in honor of the white sacred tree over the primordial sands. But here's the catch. The way in which the imaginary tree creates worlds is by absorbing the Sea of Quanta and conforming it into coherent and legible matter. And if you remember when the traveler met Canotilla and went with her to the dream realm of Rene's prophecy, the abyssal world appeared to Canotilla as a warm garden, and the rift hound that attempted to kill the traveler was a dog trying to play. However, what is insane is that this property is not unique to Canotilla. Every Melusine sees the world like this, and their vision is something that they inherited from their father Elenus. Now, remember that Rene noted that the power of the Gvarena, just like the power of the Abyss, had its own will, and Rhine-Daughter extracted Elenas's will from the Abyss and created him using Chemia, which involves the imaginary force. This process of creation is likely one of the arrogations of mankind that the Sustainer talks about during the opening cutscene, and is also why Albedo asks the Traveler if creation is an act of arrogance. But why is it an act of arrogance? Why did Narcissus and Cruz say that a person's will is an obstacle? And what the hell does any of this have to do with Child's vision and the All-Devouring Narwal? Okay, here's the answer. During the Travail trailer, Dainsleif says,
"The gods goad us on with the promise of their 7 treasures, rewards for the worthy, the doorway to divinity."
Dainsleif here is referring to the 7 elemental visions, and as I stated before, the process of obtaining a vision exemplifies the hero's journey and is in a way a process of rebirth. Now remember that when Buddha was born, he walked 7 steps from his mother and 7 lotuses sprouted with each step. Lotuses represent life and rebirth. Here I want to remind you of Carl Jung's concept of the 3 realms, the known, unknown, and the dream world in between. Keep in mind that when Buddha walked, he pointed a hand to the sky and one to the earth, saying that he alone is the honored one across all realms. Additionally, the imaginary tree of the Hoyoverse sprouted from the Sea of Quanta, and if we extend this logic to the Primordial One, then he likely originates from the Abyss, which would then be the Sea of Quanta. But what's crazy is that clues do not end here. When Rhine-Daughter created Elenus, she extracted his will from the Abyss. But when the Shade of Life created Igeria, she used materials that belong to Tevat, and the exact same source states that this is unlike the creation of humans. So, if the Primordial One did not create humans from materials that fully belong to Tevat, then he surely must have used something else as a blueprint. And now it is about to get really crazy, so get ready. Notice how the All-Devouring Narwal is quite literally Child's constellation, and its title is the Visitor from the Far Side of the Sea of Stars. Additionally, when Tartaglia got close to Fontaine, his vision began to stop working. And here I want to take you back to what Boer said about visions.
The heavens grew eyes to behold the true beauty of the world below, but humans already have eyes to begin with. So, what is it they see when they look at the world not with their eyes, but their vision? You're very smart. Can you figure out what the answer is?
Notice how Boris says the heavens grew eyes, not the gods, the heavens. Therefore, what Boer is referring to regarding the source of visions are not the conventional gods of Tevat, but rather divine beasts that exist beyond the false sky and make up the constellations of Tevat. Which means that the primordial one created humans by copying or extracting the will of various celestial beasts from the cosmic sky. And this explains why vision wielders are able to resist the abyss. They can do so not because of their visions, but rather because they have the capacity to obtain a vision in the first place. Vision wielders, unlike people such as Renee and Jacob who are native to Tevat, are created by the primordial one using the will of divine celestial beasts, and that explains why vision wielders are called Allegenes and have the potential to ascend to Celestia. It is because they are unawakened vessels of divinity to begin with. And that is the it that Dainsleif talks about. The it that Skirk senses in Child. Alright, we're almost done, I promise. Only 2 more sections remain, this one along with the outro, which will consist of some really quick thoughts I have about René de Petitcourt. Something that I found interesting for a while in Genshin is that the description of the Violet Court domain states that in the ancient past, the mountains rose higher than the skies, and the earth was larger than the heavens' dome. But one day the mirror shattered and the oceans arose. This is interesting for 2 reasons. The first is that it is mentioning the ocean levels rising. Now, I've already talked about this before. In fact, I made several videos talking about it. But Klee's mother Alice was once talking with Zhongli in Juyong Cast when she told him that the place looks like it should belong at the bottom of the ocean, implying that someone artificially lifted the land. This is something that Zhongli found hilarious, laughing about it extensively according to Alice. And if you remember the description of the Court of Flowing Sands that I talked about earlier, it mentions the antediluvian times. And the word antediluvian means before the flood. Now, we know that Tevat gets eradicated every now and then by enormous floods that destroy civilization. But knowing what we know now in Fontaine, these floods could very well be connected to the cosmic beasts. Furthermore, the Violet Court mentions the shattering of the mirror, and Genshin is full of mirror references. For example, René de Petitcourt talks about the Looking Glass, and as we know, Alice, who is a witch, is inspired by Alice in Wonderland, and its sequel, Alice Through the Looking Glass. But what am I trying to say? Well, as I said before, I suspect that Arlecchino is a witch. And as we know, she has a pyrovision, and fire represents hell, along with the fact that her name is taken from a devil called Arlecchino, who appears in plays about the crucifixion of Christ, and her eyes are 2 cross marks. Interestingly, Arlecchino is a member of the Fatui who happen to wear masks, and as you know, masks are a mean to hide one's true identity, to hide the self. Now, we know that the forbidden knowledge causes humans to become sick, and the curse of the wilderness turns them into Hillycrows. Dainsleif also states that Hillycrows wear their masks because they fear knowing their true fates, in other words, knowing their true identity. When the Abyss sibling was with Clothar, we see firsthand what happens to a Hillycrow who removes his mask through Caniber, then discovers himself and dies. Do you know who else died when he discovered himself? That's right, Narcissus. This could have a lot of implications for René's plan when he took over Laris and absorbed the people of the Ordo into himself, denying them their will and by extension their visions. In myths, witches are known to communicate with devils and otherworldly spirits, but in the context of Genshin Impact, these otherworldly beings would then logically be the Abyss. But in a more realistic scenario, what if they are the cosmic beasts that make up the constellations? This means that Arlecchino's vision represents the gaze of her celestial beast, wherever it may be. And while I highly doubt that Arlecchino is related to the Hexen Circle, it is worth noting that so many members of the Hexen Circle are known to dabble with the worlds beyond. Alice, Nicole, Rhindaughter, and Barbella all have direct knowledge of other worlds. What I'm trying to say here is that Celestia and the Abyss are likely 2 sides of the same coin, 2 opposing powers that come from the same place, but have different ideologies and thus come into conflict with one another. And in between their arrogant conflict in the cosmic darkness lies what Dainsleif speaks about. The land of dreams, yet to be dreamed. Alright, we have reached the end of this video, so I want to take a quick moment to share my thoughts about René. René de Petitcourt is the pinnacle of narcissism. After all, it was René who did not heed the warnings of the Order of Skeptics and turned Jacob into an iniquitous Baptist because he thought he knew better. After all, it was René who killed Carter and severed his friendship with Alan and Marianne. After all, it was René who put a prophecy he saw above the lives of others, manipulating and deceiving those he considered idiots into his cult, taking advantage of their trust and conviction. And in the end, how pathetically ironic is it that René, who feared death so much so that he committed all those sacrifices and sought to turn humanity immortal, ended up himself losing his individuality and sense of self, dissolving into his own delusions. Just like the young hunter Narcissus, obsessed with his reflection in the water, never being able to touch it, until he melted and nothing of him remained but a field of flowers, René's vision of the future will remain but an illusion on the waters, never to be fulfilled, until nothing of him remains but a naive dream, the memory of a fool who thought he knew better.